Good morning. It is March 9th, 2023 at approximately 9 a.m. my time. And my name is Patrick Lovell, and welcome to my Truth Bomb. These are a series of sort of trying to filter the way the world works within the mechanics of power to convey information that I have that I've learned over the course of quite a long time now. And hopefully it lands to generate an epic movement to deal with what we're all in the midst of. So this morning is as interesting as any morning, maybe more so in a lot of ways. But before I get started, and I'm going to try to keep it pretty tight, but I'd like to reintroduce myself to hopefully people that are discovering me for the first time. Don't know how that might happen in the grand symphony of algorithms and how this might find its way and wind its way to whatever eyeballs might be on me at any given time. But you never know if people are familiar with you or if they're just seeing you for the first time and what you're all about. So here goes for a quick recap of who I am. I'm a television producer. I'm an investigative journalist. I've produced a series called The Con. You can find that at www.thecon.tv. I've also been very active, probably have delivered somewhere in the order of thousands of hours of truth bombs in different variations. You can find me on TikTok at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs The Con. You can find me on YouTube at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs The Con. And also, we've produced a really significant online podcast series with our friends from the Real Progressives called The New Untouchables. And I would highly encourage you to delve into that as well. For those of you who, might be a little bit sort of apprehensive about scoping things out for fear that there might be a cost involved and still not having a full sense of what I am, but maybe interested enough to give it a try, I would encourage you to go to the Con at www.thecon.tv and just click on videos, and there you'll find an array of approximately 30 what we call microdocs that lay out a lot of incredibly important information in terms of structure and the power and the system that we're actually in the midst of, that everybody is seemingly, and I mean everybody, is either trying to find an understanding of how our system and power is working and grifting its way to whatever it is within all the context of, quite frankly, the madness that continues to reveal itself. So this morning, what's important to sort of connect the dots on, the connective tissue, is primarily the revelation of Matt Taibbi's Twitter files and his pronouncement to Congress. Matt Taibbi did some extremely important work. I know there's some controversy. There's some controversy for me, considering that I'm a big fan of Matt Taibbi and I know his history. So I'm not sure if I thought initially that the Twitter files were the best expression of what I know Mr. Taibbi is capable of, as I think one of the leading muckraking journalists, independent journalists in our country. At times, I thought one of the best America has ever produced, and I still do to a degree. And but I was a little apprehensive about certain things of the Twitter files just because of how it seemed to kind of feed, the stoking of Twitter based on Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and his would have now become much more clear resentment of what he might call the left and censorship. But they did reveal that there is this confluence between, intelligence agencies of the United States and influence to suppress tweets, feeds, using techniques such as shadow banning and other scenarios that I'm absolutely quite certain that Mr. Elon Musk is still doing, just in reverse. But what Matt Taibbi and his colleagues have proved is that you can't have a massive, widespread intelligentsia movement to suppress misinformation or disinformation and have free speech at the same time. They're non-compatible. Some of you might immediately jump to the idea that, well, democracy and capitalism are not compatible. And interestingly enough, in this day and age, that would be a correct statement. I don't think it has always been that way, and I don't think it should be that way. given what it is that I deliver to you through these truth bombs, which are an amalgamation, an evolution, an understanding of literally, the 10,000 hour rule. I mean, I've spent literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours, really delving into what is a reflection of how power has consolidated and become what it is during this era, which I put at the last 20 years. I mean, it's really more like the last 40, 50 years, but this is seemingly kind of the end game, if you will. And the reason why I'm creating a effort to create a populist tidal wave to purge corruption that I'm asking for your buy-in. But I'll get to that downstream. But I'll just say this as kind of a pivot, that we, the people of the United States, have been jacked around by this incredibly diabolical system, this machine of deception, of inside pool, of corruption. Everybody knows it. Everybody always says the system is rigged. Everybody says that the system is corrupt, but unfortunately, people do not understand the details of who did what, when, and how, and why we are what we are, which is what I have all the answers to. And who am I? Do I walk on water? Do I part the water? Am I Moses? Am I Jesus? No, man. I'm just a dude that actually did the fucking work, which is what it actually requires when you are a journalist. And trust me, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life, because I wasn't always a investigative journalist or a muckraker. And I'll get to that in just a minute too, but I don't want to carry on forever. I just want to try to make some prescient points. So going back to the Twitter files, in context to this mass revelation of what's happening with the Dominion voting booth lawsuits against Fox News Corporation, helmed by none other than Rupert Murdoch and his whole team, and really what's in the crosshairs of a lot of conversation in the past 2 days, and is really revolting and reviling and actually revealing, is the nature of Tucker Carlson. And so, of course, Tucker Carlson, for those who have been paying attention, who have been getting the messaging, although many that watch Fox would never know this is actually happening unless they're getting it and seeing it through small composites of information that somehow filter through to their feed. But it was made evident through subpoenaed testimonies of what took place at Fox during the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. Tons of revelations stemming from Tucker Carlson literally hates his audience, despised Donald Trump, thought Donald Trump was the worst, threat to the United States, and couldn't wait for the day a reckoning came, and other revelations that are just really interesting. And for some that are reporting this, shocking, reviling, revolting, and all the rest of it. To me, I find it interesting because, observing Tucker from afar, as I do Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper, I'm not surprised that Tucker Carlson, like Hillary Clinton, had an inside sort of outside voice, parameter. And, now Tucker is reconfiguring the insurrection, cherry picking, spoon fed Capitol footage that was given to him by, the head, Speaker of the House, why can't I think of his name? I was about to say Joseph McCarthy. It'll come to me in a second. I'm kind of swimming with a bunch of names right now. But obviously, there was kind of a quid pro quo when we went through the whole scenario with, this gentleman becoming the Speaker of the House. And I don't know why I'm thinking about McCarthy this whole time. And I know many of you would probably screaming the name out at me. And it'll come to me in just a minute. But, Tucker Carlson was spoon-fed 40,000 hours of footage, in which he's now presenting sort of recreate of what took place on January 6th to make it look like, oh yeah, everybody that was there, including the shaman, were basically there as, citizens protesting their government, more like sightseers, as opposed to what we all saw that led to the deaths of several police officers in a shooting, and all of the other things that manifested, from the insurrection that led to the January 6th congressional committee hearings, and where we are at this stage of the game. But the most important point that I want to, address is that in light of Matt Taibbi's The Twitter Files, and this sort of fusion between big tech and really the intelligence apparatus of the United States, is kind of a new McCarthyism, and that's why McCarthy is sticking into my brain at the moment. But meanwhile, mainstream media has absolutely zero credibility. So think about it. The intelligentsia is out there getting into personal people's, creating algorithms of people that could be a threat, to suppress, to suborn, to shadow ban specific journalists and others out there. I put myself in that category. I don't have anything but anecdotal evidence and just a lot of, quite frankly, suspicion. But it would explain a lot in why you and millions of people don't understand the eureka of which I have the answers to, that can pull the curtain back and reveal to you exactly how the machine works and who's operating the machine and how they have their hands on the controls and what those control input and output actually create. But going back to Tucker Carlson and mainstream media, is that as revolting as Tucker is, and I put these guys at the highest because their cynicism, their approach, their really disgust for democracy, based on carving out the business model of, let's say they have to get 3 million viewers a night to be able to suffice the ad rates that they have for their corporate, advertisers, justifies, and I know this business because I've been in it for 30, 40 years, is, from advertising and media, it's based on ratings and based on, what the Nielsen's and, the eyeballs manifest in terms of the standard that advertisers are going to pay per hour. And that's what facilitates the Fox business model, and what Rupert Murdoch and the entirety of this Dominion subpoenas and revelations from emails reveal is an intent to lie to the audience, because that's what the audience wants to hear. And so they continue to feed the audience lies and deception that basically manifested an insurrection and a coup d'etat of the United States government by none other than Donald Trump, who was not at any point of this entirety of the thing, which is another conversation, the mastermind behind this whole thing. I can give you a handful of, bullet points to consider that Donald Trump and his business acumen has demonstrated buffoonery his entire existence, that many, sort of interpret as kind of like an all-star wrestling approach, which is true. We've all seen the WWE, right? The WWF, World Wrestling Federation. It's all an act. And so that's kind of what, quite frankly, the defense attorneys at Fox, as well as MSNBC, had argued successfully against libel suits last year, that nobody who watches these programs, Rachel Maddow, Anderson Cooper, or Tucker Carlson, expects truth. They're entertainment, and that's what the judges allowed. So here's this quandary about free speech, but it's also about media, and it's also about lies. And so it's incredible to me that we're relying upon the Dominion lawsuit and the subpoenas to get this information about something as important as literally a coup d'etat. For me, as an investigative journalist, the ultimate reflection of this is that mainstream media, or legacy media, is dead. And it has been for a long time. And that's why I continue to deliver truth bomb after truth bomb, because of the thousands of hours of information I've laid out there and the thousands of hours that I've aggregated over the years to tell you what it is that I'm about to tell you, of who did what, when, and how, and who actually controls the power, and why we have to come together as a mass populist movement to elevate the truth above the ocean of madness and lies and deception that has complete control of the system. I refer to it as the Borg. Many of us who grew up in the 70s and think about it, might want to look at it through the construct of, the Empire, right? Darth Vader and the Emperor and that full paradigm, which is control. In humanity, going back to the beginning, literally society has always had to sort of parse out, leadership and cooperation for survival. And then it just manifested throughout, the eons of humanity, and corruption has been there every step of the way, as has power grabs and different versions of how things are supposed to operate. And of course, we've had thousands of years of tyranny, we had thousands of years of slavery, and we had ideals and, sorts of variables of democracy and liberty, stemming from the Greek Empire through the Roman Empire, but then it all got corrupted and then ultimately manifested through a series of events that led to the United States that, of course, in 1776, we had the Declaration of Independence, followed later, 13 years later, the ratification of ultimately what led to the Constitution, which creates separation of powers, which, of course, requires the integrity of law. So over the course of the last, I don't know, let's call it 20 years, I think many of us have been exposed to nonstop declarations and questions, particularly during the Trump administration, of no man or person, and they leave out this one all the time, which is the most important one: corporation is above the law. Now, I can tell you, after my evolution, where after the 2008 great financial crisis, where I got buried by an economic tidal wave, that it took me years and years and years to reconfigure my mind and my understanding of how actually power works, to realize that that idea of the ideal that no man or person or corporation is above the law is absolute bullshit, because of the nature of initially the ideas of the architecture of the United States based on separation of powers predicated upon the law and independence of the judiciary and the administrative and the judicial branch, or the executive branch, is ideally the way, through common sense and cooperation, that you can understand that the ship could float, right? That it could become dynamic, that it could create this sort of, economic engine of capitalism and free markets where, see a need, fill a need, which was the opposite of the tyranny of aristocracy, to create a rising tide raises all ships sort of scenario, which at different times in history, in the American history, has delivered, sometimes better, sometimes worse. We've had eras, for example, of the robber barons, which were just that era's new aristocracy that had to be battled by a populist movement that really came from a progressive era where, human rights and women's suffrage and environmental rights and workers' and labor's rights and farmers' rights and all of those things were in order to form a more perfect union that manifested ultimately to Teddy Roosevelt's, trust busting, which put more power into the government of the United States than the robber barons. It benefited, if you get into technicalities, in some manner, shape, or form, Rockefeller, of course, and, that's a whole nother story, but the cycle continues to where we end up, with this incredibly, at least on its face, thriving, roaring 20s, new technology, new credit, new ways to evolve the American dream, only to fall on its face during the Great Depression because of a lot of the scenarios that played out that ultimately we learned our lessons from, to where we created new laws to combat the problems that created the Great Depression that we did and manifested through the New Deal, that ultimately led to about 50 to 60 years of, I'd say, relative sanity in a system that actually worked to a degree until we had this full-on run of neoliberalism and globalism and then centralization of power through deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization that led that spawned from the late 90s and the Clinton administrations, that led to basically what I call corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate. Was that a mouthful? What it led to was corruption. It just led to the powerful using deception, deceptive acts and practices, and an illusion of free markets to create the greatest trick the devil ever played, was to convince the world he didn't exist, which led to my evolution, which they kept pissing on my head, telling me it was rain. Look, Tucker Carlson's a liar. Fox lies. That's their business model. They proved it in court. They've proved it to the world. The question will become is twofold. One is, why did it take a subpoena in an investigation by a corporation to get what we call discovery, as opposed to, let's say, the New York Times and the Department of Justice and the FBI doing the exact same thing that could lead to criminal indictments? Well, eventually that might happen. I'm not quite sure. But you know what? We've had such an era of insane race to the gutter corruption and criminality, that it would lead to the opportunity to where a guy by the name of Donald J. Trump, who's been doing this his entire career, could rise to become the president of the United States. And as a result of that, we just normalized corruption. And ultimately, we did it because of what I'm an expert in, and which I'll get to in just one moment. But, ultimately, Donald Trump's broken so many laws long before he was ever a president. It's a wonder to me that the guy wasn't indicted, had his businesses scrapped, thrown in jail, and all sorts of other things before he ever had a chance to run for the president of the United States. While he was in office, he lied 5,000 times to the American people. We still haven't had time to catch up with investigations of what took place during the pandemic emergency stimulus sort of scenarios that I'm pretty sure that Trump and his cronies got their fingers in to a large degree. And we now know nobody's talking about it at the moment, but they could be talking about it soon. Guys like Jared Kushner and Steve Mnuchin, Trump's former, Treasury Secretary, are deeply involved with Saudi Arabia. And that's another bag, whatever metaphor, manifestation of the worms that you want to fill in the blanks on, because there's a continuity between 9/11, 2008, and everything that's come after. And it's just who's got the money and who doesn't, and who has the power and who doesn't, and how do they control it, and how do they puppeteer the system, and what the hell is the judiciary doing? And I can tell you what the judiciary is not doing, is holding this shit to account and being independent. Why? Because big money through the Koch and other institutions have found ways to be able to, and it's not just those high-level billionaires, trust me, it's corporations in all sorts of weird shapes or forms with attorneys general around the United States that host fundraising affairs, because all politicians require money to get into office. And so if they're going to get the money from the corporations that are putting them there, they're going to end up, and this goes for the judges, making rules and judgments based on what's good for those that supported their career. And that's called the revolving door, and it's called corruption. And we've practically legalized it, and everything's a myth. And our, the worst actors in this whole paradigm, quite frankly, is big law. So the big law, ironically, right, we're supposed to be a nation of laws where the integrity of law gives everybody a fair shake, where we have upward mobility in society, and no man or person through the right to vote or through the law is any more powerful or less powerful than anyone else. That's what we call citizenship. That's ideally what the founding fathers and the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union, and our entire history has tried to manifest. But unfortunately, that's not reality. The reality is what was reflected on the front page of the New York Times this morning, which is, why does poverty persist? And this person who is a sociologist, who has all of the resources to do the deep delve academic sort of investigations, come up with all of these wonderful sort of insights and, big time, let's just call it statistics that are important, but without understanding what it is that's the heart of the matter, which is corruption. But ultimately, you might be saying to yourself after listening to all of this, okay, Patrick, I've given you however many minutes this is, and you still haven't convinced me that you know who did what, when, and how that plays into everything that we're watching, which is overwhelming, and I can't seem to, not stop looking at my watch or listening to my phone, or, actually getting my phone in between listening to this, what you call Truth Bomb, which is actually a lecture, and I don't want to be lectured to because I've got more important things to do. But meanwhile, you're trying to find the source of what's creating the corruption. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here this long. The source of the corruption is money. Okay, well, where does money come from? Isn't it, all of these great successful operations that have been around for a long time, that have, fostered what the society needs, that we all consume, that, it enables those corporations to survive, and they function in a benevolent way, so that, it's working within the construct of the law. And so therefore there's an equilibrium, and I can go to the grocery store and get, whatever I need, and because I've got my job and everything else. Okay, it depends on where you fit in the pecking order and the system and everything else, but I think all of us will acknowledge that inflation has become a significant problem, and also stagflation, to where people aren't making enough money to keep up with the increased cost of everything, or at the same time, maybe you just lost your job. I know that there was a lot of layoffs at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and in big tech particularly. But going back to the power structure, we had an upheaval in 2008. That was a result of really, let's call it going back to the early 90s, that creating a housing bubble, particularly after 9/11, where the Federal Reserve and the government of the United States, in the aftermath of that horrific tragedy, decided they're going to stimulate the economy. And they did so after we've had 4 decades of shopping out the industrial golden goose, that we were going to basically reconfigure the economy around housing. And we did. But we created a global Ponzi scheme based on deceptive acts and practices and lies that we lay out in The Con at www.thecon.tv. The whole thing was a liar's economy. It was a mythical economy based on liar's loans, not subprime, but liar's loans. There's a lot to it. We lay it out in The Con, in The New Untouchables, and many of my truth bombs. But what it gets to is the ultimate expression of what it is that you need to understand in context to all of this crazy, atmosphere of, quite frankly, chaos for everyone except the power who's operating exactly the way they want it to operate. Okay? So when the world blew up in 2008, basically all of our financial system was bankrupt based on this incredible Ponzi scheme of deception. They were done. So if you live in a free market capitalistic society, what's supposed to happen is they all go bankrupt. They all go out of business. All of the CEOs lose their compensation, what they gained during this. Many of them go to prison based on what we show you in The Con. And then the country goes through a Great Depression. And because of the pain and the suffering and whatever it leads to, which could have been a global war, and I think that's what they thought was going to happen, because the global structure collapsed completely. The powers that be in charge decided to do a, duck dive, smoke and mirrors, massive operation that the likes that either the CIA was involved with or the CIA, was deeply appreciative of. Because what we ended up having were all the top apex players, both in government and in business, that part of this continuum of revolving door that also involves big law, for example, and all the white shoe law firms, ultimately pulled off this scenario where the Federal Reserve piped in trillions and trillions upon trillions of dollars to the guys, the CEOs, the operations, the financiers that created this absolute debacle. Because they weren't operating within the equilibrium of supply and demand. They were just nuking a new sort of part of the economy to create a sort of bubble in light of what happened to prop up the structure after 9/11 so we didn't collapse then. And it ultimately led to financial terrorism that replaced, international terrorism. And ultimately, through what I had prefaced before, deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization, led to basically the mob. And I call it the mafiocracy. So the Dons, who are the CEOs who use control fraud through modern executive compensation, because that's how they get paid, through a technique called Gresham's dynamic, where they perverted the marketplace to get everybody in the food chain to lie, deny, shouldn't say that because that's a Trumpism. Trump, lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. But Trump came out of this era as well, and quite frankly, his business model was the same, where all of these deceptive acts and practices created liar's loans that blew up the economy, which led to Federal Reserve Act 13.3 being used illegally by all of the powers that be, that sold Congress and the world, even though I'm pretty sure Congress understood what happened, and the media is too stupid to understand what actually happened, and they backdoored trillions of dollars to the criminals that blew up the fucking world. And then the DOJ decided to push everything out and ultimately, got what we call settlements. So it played out with this PR sort of scenarios where, the too big to fail banks pay $250 billion in fines. Meanwhile, nobody is aware that 10 million plus houses were foreclosed upon illegally based on deceptive acts and practices that, created tens of millions of felonies that blew up the world in a financial terrorism that led to 50 million Americans being devastated initially by the foreclosure crisis. Just heard a crazy noise. By the foreclosure crisis, and then ultimately, but it hit everybody because you had the pensioners, you had You had really municipalities and governments and everything else that failed. And then ultimately, what we did was we just built Humpty Dumpty backed up using financialization because the United States government has the power because of fiat currency to create money to be able to sustain itself, and that's the way it's designed. However, if you look at the statutes and you understand what Federal Reserve Act 13.3 is supposed to do in light of why the Federal Reserve exists, particularly in light of emergencies, i.e., lender of last resort capacity. So if you've got a sovereign currency and you can manifest budget, to create, debt spending to create economies and markets and that sort of thing, which is what we're created to do. And there is a separation between monetary policy and fiscal policy. But the long and the short of it is that when the whole system blew up, we were all sold in the public that we had what was known as the TARP funds, which is $700 billion emergency spending program from Congress that was supposed to shore up the economy by buying what they were calling at the time toxic assets. The toxic assets were these liar's loans that the banks actually created that blew up the world. And so if we had capitalism, they would have all gone bankrupt. We would have nationalized the banks. We would have started from scratch, and we would have had to recontextualize the whole thing. And who knows if we would have had a war or some sort of like absolute insane outbreak, that followed that whole thing, which probably would have happened. But instead, we created, what led to what this piece in the front page of the New York Times was talking about today, which is, of course, the poverty economy and why poverty persists. It persists because of fraud, because of control fraud, which is not a democracy, which isn't a country where the Constitution and the law is sacred and supreme. It's not. It's all a lie. The power structure controls everything, and the way it manifests itself is in this sort of civil war of identity that's played out in what we call mainstream media. And so going back to the beginning of this truth bomb, Matt Taibbi has revealed that the intelligentsia is working with tech to suppress you and me. But meanwhile, mainstream media is grifting everybody. Mainstream media isn't telling you what it is that I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is so beyond comprehension bigger than Watergate. And at the time of Watergate, for example, every mainstream paper was in on it. It was happening 24/7. You couldn't escape it. And the entire consciousness of the country was paying attention to what was right and wrong and seeing whether or not government could demonstrate whether it could hold power to account, which is why our government of, by, and for the people was designed the way it does. And it actually delivered to a degree. Not perfect, but to a degree. And there was a lot of problems happening at the same time. It was a revolution in civil rights, and then we had Vietnam, and yet it was the most amazing time government had ever, committed, through the Great Society Project of LBJ to deal with poverty and everything that Martin Luther King was dealing with at the time. But of course, Martin Luther King gets assassinated, JFK gets assassinated, and things go catastrophic for a while, which is history. Okay, so where are we now, and what's going to happen next? Well, what I'm telling you is that without the facts, without the details, without the knowledge of understanding who did what, when, and how, without the theories, without the actual understanding of the mechanics of the structure, which is extremely complicated, but still, I think when you lay out the evidence and the facts to the American people the way we have in our work, and also what I have throughout my truth bombs and so forth, people become enlightened. They become invigorated. They can see the forest for the trees. They're not playing this identity freaking reactionary tools in the full circus scenario to where they are reacting and blaming the other. See, that's what power has done throughout history. When you look at, like now you have people like Rachel Maddow, screaming from the top of her lungs that, we're, on the verge of losing our democracy and going to the autocrats and strongman villains. And then she uses, all of her information, basically always starting with Trump, through Putin, and then, Viktor Orban, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from Hungary, and then things that we're starting to see manifest, like, for example, in our own country, through the Republican Party, and most notably a guy like Ron DeSantis down in Florida. And it's all shocking. But what I say is corruption births fascism. And so we've seen Fox now revealed, because it took a corporation to get the subpoena, to get to discovery that all of these freaking, high school freaking mouthpieces are then high paid at that, because they get paid a shit ton of money, and they basically butchered the actual investigative journalism part, and they rely on independent people that get books, or whatever they're relying upon in the echo chamber, and it becomes personality driven opinion entertainment, which is what we might construe as mainstream media in this incredibly loud atmosphere of everybody has a voice, but at the same time some much more than others because of algos and suppression that I just laid out because of what was revealed in the Twitter files. And so here I am with this information that Rachel Maddow is equally, in my opinion, guilty as Tucker Carlson is as it relates to Donald Trump and the insurrection, but only with Rachel Maddow as it relates to everything I'm telling you. She's the director of communications for the Democratic Party, and you never, on any of her deep dives into corruption and everything else, will hear her talk about former Attorney General Eric Holder, who was largely responsible for everything that I'm telling you, not to mention Barack Obama, who led all of this stuff. Basically, all you need to understand about the Obama administration is he rode a populist wave into office based on his proclamation of change we could believe in, which is a platitude. And then he put in power all of the people that created the problems that I'm telling you about. And they've got names and faces. Larry Summers from Harvard, who, is probably the worst of the worst, responsible for ultimately the deregulation with Robert Rubin, who was former CEO of Goldman Sachs turned Secretary of Treasury under the Bush administration. They had the president's working group under Clinton at that time, where they got rid of Brooks Lee Bourne and the derivatives regulation that led to, and to put this into perspective, there was, like, for example, just recently with the FTX debacle and the blowout with Sam Bankman-Fried, and all of this other hoopla and this insane, what is being called embezzlement, led to a $9 billion hole in the balance sheet of FTX and Alameda Research that, investors got fucking their money stolen, just simply put, right? But to put that into comparison, what I'm talking about in 2006, 7, and 8 was 600 to 800 trillion in derivatives based on what I just said. I say it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. In a lot of ways it is rocket science, but you got to understand the fundamentals, the ABCs. How are companies supposed to operate? How is the law supposed to operate? How is government supposed to operate? If you understand all of those elements, you'll understand how it's not operating correctly, which is the result of all of this stuff. So I don't know who you are and why you're watching, where you fit in the paradigm and everything else, but I can assure you that nobody's coming to the rescue to reboot the United States. Now, we've heard recently through the World Economic Forum, with the billionaires that meet in Davos, Switzerland, they frequently talk about the Great Reset through this guy, Charles Schwab, or not, is it not Charles Schwab? Whatever his name is. He's like a villain out of, an Austin Powers or a James Bond movie, depending on the day. But, who doesn't understand that when the global elite meet, it's to basically determine the outcome of what works for their interests, which has control of the world. And that's been going on for the last many, many decades. When they talk about globalism and they talk about supply chains and they talk about, it's this system that this network has created, to deliver everything that this system supposedly needs for the benefit of the shareholders is the way it's designed. But if they break the law or they're destroying the world, they shouldn't exist. But most notably, if they break the law. But see, the thing is, they break the law all the fucking time. But then they write the law, then they rewrite the law, and then if they get into any trouble, they've got Congress owned and they've got media owned. Guys, it's a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal system, syndicate, and it's global. We can debate what's going on in Ukraine, and I don't need to smile about that. That's a horrific scenario. And Putin and whatever potentially is going to come out of China and Taiwan. These are tumultuous times. If you know your history, you know that it didn't take everything that I'm talking about enough to trigger World War I. I mean, that was, in comparison to this, child's play. And I think 30, 40 million people died in World War I. We know that 70 million plus people died in World War II. What's coming next? My pitch to you is that I have to be able to get this truth in front of people in a way that they're going to pay attention, which would be multimedia, barnstorming tour with the facts and the information that I've already spent years and millions of dollars aggregating. And what I'm asking you guys to contribute is $13 to our fundraising campaign to create a populist tidal wave to purge corruption. Now you can do that with the link that's below, and you know, and hopefully you can come on board, because look, again, going back to my point about the 2008 great financial crisis, we have literally 50 million people in this country that went through this. So if you're one of them, or if you know somebody who went through this, I'm fighting for you. And you're not going to be able to afford thousands of dollars in contributions to somebody who's going to support you in the Senate or anywhere else. I'm asking you for $13 contribution and to get 13 people to donate. And the reason I'm doing that is because that unless we have literally thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and hopefully millions of people coming together under this banner of truth that reveals what the entire system of corruption has buried, which means it's buried the American dream, it's buried the American promise, it's betrayed us, it's supplanted us, it's viciously destroying us, and quite frankly, the sustainability of the world, because it's not held to account, because the law is not working to suppress or hold power to account. Neither is the media. So if I can get 1,300 contributors, we raised $16,900. That's enough to get organized. That's enough for me to go to the FEC and put my name as a candidate for the 2024 presidential election. And we can use that to centralize an effort, a movement to elevate the evidence of what the entire system has hit. It's the emperor's new clothes. That's all there is to it. The future of the world depends on it. You can't drive in any city in the United States and not notice homeless people everywhere, sleeping under underpasses. You know about the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, and then the second derailment that happened that I haven't heard much about since. You see the not fallibility, it's literally just the betrayal of media because of what I laid out throughout this whole thing. And then ultimately the betrayal of government. Do you not think that all of this plays in with what we just saw, over the course of the last election, where, the Republicans got a hair above, and I continue to go back. I can't think of the name of the Speaker of the House who gave 40,000 hours to Tucker Carlson, who isn't McCarthy, but you know who I'm talking about, and I apologize. I've got a lot of information in my head, and I know the second I turn this off I'll get there. Anyway, whatever. Thank you for listening. If after this I've somehow compelled you, I've inspired you, I've motivated you, please share the word. Please donate. Please get involved. I'm not asking you for $1,300. I'm asking you for $13 and to ask 13 people. If we can get to 13 million people, we'd have $169 million. Do you think we could actually change at least the attention structure to these problems that I'm talking about? If we had that sort of buy-in from the American people, we'll win. We'll overcome this. I promise you, not everybody in the United States is diabolical. Not everybody in the United States is a sellout. Not everybody in the United States is a weak or a coward or willing to give up what our country is just because they don't know what else to do. I don't know why it's incumbent upon me to do this. I don't know why I've had to endure this, but I've suffered through more than I can relate. But it's like, I've got the information. I can't quit. Please support us. Please get involved. And we would love volunteers. Onwards and upwards.